Software Engineering Radio, episode 105, Retrospectives with Linda Rising.
This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 10 days. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast.
Okay, welcome listeners to another episode of Software Engineering Radio, another episode recorded at QCon, and I have to say thanks for the Microsoft folks, because the room we are in is officially paid for by Microsoft for whatever they want to do with it. Anyway, so today we're going to talk to Linda Rising, and so welcome Linda to the show.
I'm very happy to be here, and I agree. This is a wonderful room and has a beautiful view.
Yeah, air conditioning is a little bit loud, but we'll probably edit that out.
But it's in London. It's in beautiful London.
Okay, so Linda, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Okay, I'm Linda Rising. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a long way from London.
Mm-hmm.
The weather there in Phoenix is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a little bit chillier here in London. I'm an independent consultant, and my primary interests are patterns, retrospectives, agile development processes, and the change process. And I've recently become interested in primates.
You mean like apes?
Like apes.
Okay.
And the brain.
Okay.
So I'm willing to talk about any or all of those things.
Okay, so the plan for today, we're serious podcast. We always prepare a script. Well, a couple of questions, and those are basically around retrospectives, because you're really an authority there, I'd say.
I'm an advocate for retrospectives, and in fact, in a month, I'll be coming back to this part of the world for the annual retrospectives gathering.
There is a conference on it.
Yes,
mini thing.
It's a very small conference. It reminds me in a way of the patterns conferences that you're familiar with.
Yes.
So these are people who are serious advocates for the process, and we meet in a very informal way once a year. So this is our 6th, I think, annual gathering.
Okay.
So it's actually going to be in Bath.
That's here.
Outside London.
Okay,
yes.
Never heard about it. Okay, so why don't you give us the quick overview about what retrospectives are, and then we can get into the details.
So a retrospective is a time for reflection. And typically what's done is to decide what you're going to use as the focus of that reflection. So if we're talking about software development, typically an agile project would take time for reflection at the end of each iteration. Then again, a full project retrospective at the end of the project. But it's something that is a practice that can be applied to anything. In fact, those of us who are true advocates for the practice feel this is something you should do in your own life.
Yes.
You should take time to think about what's working well, what should be done differently.
So that is basically these two of those 4 magic questions that
the
typically
magic
get
questions,
the starting.
Yes. The first one is what's working well that we want to make sure we remember going forward for the next iteration, if we're talking about an iteration retrospective. Not just what's working well, but the startling things that we've uncovered. In fact, I tend to think of development nowadays as a series of experiments. So each iteration is an experiment. What is it that we're experimenting with? The purpose of the retrospective then becomes to examine the results of that experiment.
Right.
So what worked well about that experiment that we don't want to forget going forward, and then what should we do differently? And that's really going to define the experiment for the next iteration. What did we learn from all of this? Maybe there are larger lessons than just some sort of specific technique. What are larger things that we learned in the process? And the final question is, what puzzles us? And those are mysteries that we have no way of answering or addressing. But what we find is that by capturing those, we maybe come closer to a solution, or I like to think of puzzles as a message for higher level management.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Managers often come in to look at the results of retrospectives, and when they see a puzzle, something like, why do we always promise the customer that we will have this delivered in 2 weeks when we know at the outset that there's no way we're going to make that? Yeah. Why do we continue to do that? That's a puzzle.
Yeah.
We don't really have an answer for that. And I think as a manager, I would like to see those puzzles. Mm-hmm. And it also gives the developers a sense of satisfaction that we're not just throwing those away. We really care about those. And at some point, we might find a solution for that mystery.
So is it fair to say that it's fundamentally a way of optimizing the development process and the coherence of the team?
I suppose you could say that, because retrospectives serve many purposes. It's not only about answering those 4 questions with respect to the development process. It's about getting together as a group. Mm-hmm. And when the group examines what happened in the last iteration, they understand that they didn't see everything. They need to have a shared experience where I can say what I saw, you can say what you saw, and we learn from that experience. It's a great team building exercise. And there are things that we don't talk about in the normal course of our work. Things about how we felt.
Right.
Things about where we were disappointed. Things about things in our personal lives. Things that don't come out at any other time. So it's an opportunity to talk about a lot of issues.
Yeah, and as you said, in the context of the iterations, it's for me it's pretty clear that retrospectives are an essential part of agile processes.
Absolutely.
But probably not closely tied. You could do retrospectives in other environments. They might not be as effective, but
yes. And in fact, I began doing retrospectives in a company where we were doing a mixture of agile projects and traditional waterfall. And all the projects were doing some form of retrospective. I think the thing that's new is Norm Kurth's book does call out the term retrospective. And he put a different slant on the process. But certainly the process has been with us for millennia.
Right.
The military, it was the leader. I mean, the military has been doing retrospectives forever, and rightly so. Lives are on the line. They care about improving. They care about doing things better the next time. So there's always a retrospective done in any military organization.
In aviation, it's called debriefing.
Yes, and they all might have different names for it.
Sure.
Post-project review. Firefighters do it. Anytime there's criticality involved, lives are on the line, there is some sort of meeting or gathering where they discuss these questions or other similar questions. So it's certainly a process that can be applied to many different domains.
So let's bring it back to software development, because I mean we're software engineering radio. So let's talk a little bit about the logistics. You already said something about when to do it. So one thing is doing it at the end of an iteration.
Yes.
And when else?
Well, first of all, we can talk about that part of it, because when people hear about doing a retrospective, often they're concerned about the penalty. It's the illusion that a lot of the practices in agile development seem to penalize development. Pair programming is another example of that.
Penalize in the sense of that it looks like it makes things less efficient because you put 2 people in front of one computer.
Yes, exactly. Why have 2 people doing the work of one person? And until you've actually been there, it's hard to be convinced of the benefit. So there is a penalty to doing a retrospective often. If you're going to do one at the end of each iteration, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, the tremendous cost. You're saying we're going to take time every 2 weeks to do this exercise. Well, how long does that take? Are we talking about 3 or 4 days? No. We're talking about something that's very short, but it's an investment. And the penalty really is in not doing the retrospective. That what comes out of it is the true learning. I often say when I'm talking about retrospectives that we suffer under the illusion that we learn from experience. Just by having the experience, we learn. And so I always tell the story of a friend of mine who's been married 5 times. Well, surely she learned along the way. She should be improving. Or the other example I often give is, if you believe that you really learn from experience, then you've never made the same mistake twice.
Is that really true?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So we do need something, some way of examining the experience, some way of determining that we should do things differently. Not to beat ourselves up and to say that we were stupid, but to learn. And in going forward to say, oh, that didn't work so well, what are we going to do differently? And so there is an investment, but the benefit can be tremendous in that the team does really learn from the experience. It is not automatic.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the length, I guess I would say the more often you do it, the shorter each of them will become. So it can happen that the retrospective runs for 2 days.
It can, and in fact, most of the time when people don't do them very often, well, then there's a lot of material to examine and a lot of material to cover. But if you do it regularly, every 2 weeks, it's what we call a heartbeat retrospective. There is a sense that a project that is working well has a heartbeat. It has a rhythm, and the retrospective in that case can maybe take an hour or less. It's just like a Scrum meeting done well. It really has no penalty, doesn't take long at all.
So who should participate?
Well, the answer to that is anyone who should participate.
Sure, but how do I find out? I mean, one of the questions that's being asked is, do I involve management?
Yes, that's always the question that's asked. And the answer is it depends. I believe that everybody who cares about the project, you might say the stakeholders, all stakeholders should be there. But to be realistic, for an iteration retrospective, it's difficult to get everybody in the room at the same time. And in many cases, it might not be the best thing for the manager to be there.
Why?
Because what you want to hear in a retrospective is the truth. And you want people to feel safe. And you want them to be able to tell the truth. So
all the people in retrospective should be peers or equals in that sense, and not, with their oversight person in the room.
Possibly, and in many cases, the developers are perfectly comfortable with having the manager there. So if I were coming in from the outside to lead a retrospective, which typically would not happen for an iteration retrospective, someone else outside the team would lead it, because you do need an external facilitator, but you don't need to bring in someone who's outside the larger organization. But if I were coming in and I didn't know the team and I didn't know the comfort level with having anyone, the manager, the customer, the product owner, whatever the other roles are, I would do an exercise, something very simple. The one that Norm Kurth recommends is called Create Safety. And in that one, you anonymously ask for feedback to determine, well, how comfortable are you with the people in the room? And you ask people to evaluate on a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, and they'll tell you. And if they're not comfortable, in another round of that exercise, they might tell you why. Is it the manager? Is it the customer? Is it the new guy? Is it the old grizzled veteran who's going to make comments that make people feel uncomfortable? Who knows who it is? So you can just simply ask. And as long as they are given anonymously to a facilitator who's not on the team.
That's why this is important. That he's not on the team.
That he's not on the team, and that they write it on a card and you collect the cards. So it's outlined in Norm's book. But what I find when I do that exercise is that I'm often surprised that teams that seemed perfectly safe were not. And teams that seemed a little dysfunctional were perfectly safe and felt free to tell the truth.
So if we talk about this moderator type, what kind of skills does this person need to have? I mean, since you're doing this as a service, that's probably for hire, then there is probably a reason why people get you and not everybody. So what do you think are the key qualifications for being a good moderator?
Well, you're looking at facilitation skills. You want to make sure that there is an agenda, that it's followed, that there are guidelines for the meeting, just as there are guidelines for any meeting, that people turn their cell phones off, that no one speaks when someone else is speaking. So there are general guidelines that every meeting should follow. And then for the retrospective, one thing we're always very careful about is to follow Norm Kurth's prime directive. Which basically says that we are going to proceed believing that everyone on the team did the best job he or she could.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we've learned we're better at everything now than we were at the beginning.
Yeah.
But given what we knew at the time
Right.
and what we faced, what the situation was, and our understanding of it, given all of that, we want to believe, at least for the sake of the retrospective, that everyone was doing the best job he or she could.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a session about blaming.
Right. Yeah.
This is not a time to lay problems at the feet of an individual. So the rule we try to follow, in addition to all the other meeting guidelines, is no naming.
Okay.
You can talk about any problem you want.
Mm-hmm. But you don't say you did it.
No, you don't say,
Yeah.
even if everyone on the team understands
Yeah.
that when you're talking about a particular problem, that you are talking about
Sure.
an individual. So you can say, for instance, the database was late, and everyone knows that Marcus
Yeah.
was working on the database.
Yeah.
But there's a tremendous difference
Yeah.
between saying the database was late.
Yeah, and you
What
screwed
can
up
we
the
do?
project.
What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen? What can we learn from
Yeah.
that? And instead saying, Marcus screwed up.
Yeah.
We
Right.
would have been fine if it weren't for Marcus.
Yeah. Sure. Yes.
So, of course, words make a difference.
Yeah.
Words make a difference in how the team focuses on what's to be done. We're not concentrating on getting rid of Marcus. We're
Yeah.
concentrating on saying what should be done differently to make sure that we don't have to address this same problem
Yeah.
again.
So is it useful or necessary, at least for the somewhat bigger retrospectives, to do them off-site?
Well, you know, there's a pattern in the Fearless Change book that Kevlin Henney wrote. It's called
You mean
Location, Location, Location.
He wrote the pattern because I think you wrote the book. Wrote the book.
Well, we put the book together, but it's a book of patterns, and you know, patterns are written
Right.
by a community,
Yeah.
and they're workshopped by a community.
yes.
So the list of contributors is enormous,
Yeah.
and that pattern originated. So he was the originator
Okay.
of the pattern location, location, location.
Yeah.
And what it says is that for all things that you care about, where you hold that meeting, that retrospective, that training class, does make a difference.
Mhm.
People feel about the experience that it's special,
Right.
or they put more effort into it, or they're more careful about the results
Or just
that come out.
away from their email.
Just away from things, so they can't quickly run back
Yeah.
and have a quick meeting. It does make a difference where it is. But unfortunately, the reality of the corporate environment today, there isn't time,
Yeah.
there isn't the budget.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about a meeting that happens every 2 weeks,
Yeah, I mean,
it's much more difficult.
Yeah, but I guess for those things, if they're only 1 hour long or something, it's probably not necessary.
No, and I think there are other things you can do to make a
Right.
meeting special.
Mhm.
Like, I'm a big believer in food.
I knew that that would come because I obviously read your book and I thought this was one of the cornerstones of making meetings nice.
It's fundamental to human interaction. We're hardwired to behave toward each other as we were in the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And what we learned there is that the people that we break bread with are the people we trust.
Mhm.
And you might say, good heavens, Linda, you live in the country that has the fattest people on the face of the earth. Surely food is not something that people really care about anymore.
Yeah.
But we're hardwired, and we respond to those chocolate
Yeah.
chip cookies.
Right. Yeah.
So if they're on the table,
Yeah.
it makes a difference
Yeah.
in the meeting. So that's something you can do to make the meeting special
Mm-hmm.
without spending a lot of money and without hauling the group
Right.
to an expensive off-site location.
Yeah. Yeah. So assume I would hire you for a retrospective of one of my customers. I've actually been thinking about that, but
Oh, thank you.
they weren't interested. That's another story.
Oh, well.
What do I have to prepare? What do you expect the team you're going to collect data? You know, what do you have to do in order for you to be effective with a retrospective, or anybody else, obviously?
You know, the answer to that is it depends, because a lot of times teams that call me in are teams that are having struggles.
Mhm.
I don't often get called in when things are going well.
Well, I would,
It's when
yeah.
there's been a big problem.
Yeah.
And so what I get is the story of the team. I might get some contact information from people who were on the team or who were stakeholders of various kinds, so that I can have a little email discussion or a little phone conversation or maybe Skype with them to say, well, what do you think happened? What should I think about? And then, of course, the people who are calling me in, the supporters of the retrospective, have expectations. So I always have some kind of interaction with them to say, can you tell me what you're looking for? What do you expect to find?
What do you suspect a problem could be?
All kinds of information, anything that might be of interest to me. And if it's a company that I already know well, because there are times when I go back to, especially large companies, that I know a little bit about the culture. So I can ask some questions that lead me to believe whether there might be an issue with safety or not. Sometimes you don't have to do the safety exercise. Sometimes you already know. And sometimes they'll send you some project documents, a little bit of the history. What was this project all about? Since I am a developer myself, I spent a long time in development. I'm interested in that. I would like to know what was going on. And I learn myself. When I go in to do a retrospective, I learn a tremendous amount.
But you want to be paid. Just asking.
Of course, I want to be paid. So the answer is it depends. The answer is it depends on how much time. Sometimes it is a last minute decision and I walk in without a lot of pre-work. And so I try to get as much as I can. And I try to encourage the people on the team to have a little bit of an understanding of what's going to happen. So I want to know what they know about retrospectives. I want to encourage them to think about what happened over the 6 months or the 2 years or how long it's been since they had a retrospective. I want to encourage them to participate in the artifacts contest.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
One of my favorite exercises. So that takes a little preparation. They need to think back and then bring in an object to the retrospective. So I want to make sure they know what is going to happen. So to prepare them a little bit.
And in the future, what they can do is they can listen to this episode. Isn't that great?
They can. You're providing an invaluable service to the world. Wonderful.
So since we already mentioned that, how does a retrospective typically proceed? Are there like distinct phases, or is it like a ritual in some sense?
Well, there are phases to a retrospective, and sometimes you can include all the phases in an hour retrospective. For a team that does them often, you don't need to necessarily cover all the phases. But for a project retrospective, that's mostly what I see.
Yes.
So I'll talk about a project retrospective. The initial stage is called the readying. You get people prepared for the retrospective, and that would mean going over the guidelines, make sure they understood the impact of the prime directive, make sure that they have their own set of meeting guidelines or things that they typically follow. We might look at the create safety exercise, see if there are any safety issues before we start. And then the next phase is typically called looking back. It's looking at the history. So if this is something that's been running for 6 months, we want to talk about what happened. And the problem with that is that our memory spans these days are awfully short. And I say that not because I'm getting older, but because we are all under a lot of stress and we multitask and we can't remember what happened yesterday.
I agree.
Let alone what happened 6 months ago. So there are a series of exercises in Norm's book and also in Diana and Esther's book, which we're probably going to talk about.
Talk about those exercises.
So there are lots of exercises that help people remember. So that's in the looking back phase. And then you're doing all of this because you want to plan. So there are sets of exercises that you can do to get ready. We want to take action based on what we learned by looking back. So preparing for the future, looking forward, deciding what kinds of things, who will take those action items. So there are basically those 3 phases: preparation, looking back, looking forward.
So then let's take a look at some of those practices or games.
Okay.
And maybe step through a couple of them and see.
Great.
And maybe the way we do this, and just like if we discuss a patterns book, I will
Yes.
kind of, I will just mention one of the names of those practices, and you can say something about it. Of course, everybody knows that we prepared that. So, so the first one is that I didn't like write down all of them from Norm's book, but the ones that I thought are from my experience as a participant in retrospectives.
And certainly there are some
important.
I like and I use more than others.
Yep, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and tell us which those are.
Okay.
So the first one I wrote down is to define success.
Yes, it's one of my favorites. So
Great.
I start almost, I'm trying to think if there's an exception in my mind. That's how I start.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I've been learning about the brain, because remember that was one of the things I was interested in.
Yeah, we'll talk about that at the very end.
Is the brain is that it makes a difference how you start. And the first thing you think of, because our tendency, I used to think this was a characteristic of engineers, but it's a human characteristic. Our tendency is to be critical, and it's so easy. It's so easy for us to find all of the things that were wrong. And so to set the tone for the retrospective, I like the define success exercise.
And what does it do?
I begin by asking the people in the room to pretend that you're walking down the hallway of this organization and you run into someone you haven't seen for a while, and that person says to you, I hear you've been working on that project.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how's that going? And I want you to pretend that you reply to them, it's great. That project is really great because, and now what I capture on the flip chart is the rest of that sentence. It's great because. Now, sometimes it's so difficult for a team, especially if they've been through a failed project that has had some struggles. They will sit there for a moment and nothing will be forthcoming. Yeah. So you've got to give it a little time, but it's never failed that once somebody says something, so you and I know what a writer's workshop is.
I was about to mention that because that also starts with first looking at the positive aspects of a pattern.
And how many times have I gone into a writer's workshop with a paper I wasn't really fond of, and I thought, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? But again, I always find that when it starts, someone will offer a positive comment, and I think to myself, well, yes, that's right. That was good, and now that makes me think of something else. And exactly the same thing happens in Define Success. As soon as someone steps forward, and invariably someone will say something, and it's usually about the team. Yeah. This was a great group of people.
Yeah. The project was screwed, but we like each other.
And when that comes out, then others will follow. Yeah. And in a real retrospective, you let that go as long as it goes. So I use what I call the microwave popcorn test. You know when you put microwave popcorn and it goes pop, 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 pop.
Oh, I see.
Pop.
And then it's finished.
It's time to take it out.
Yeah.
Yes. So you don't wait forever. Yeah. Just to make sure you have all possible comments. Yeah. You let it go a reasonable amount of time. And what you've done with that is set the stage. Right. So people are now thinking, just as they are in a workshop, they're thinking about the good things. Yeah. And it's okay now to move on to other things. Yeah. So the next part of the exercise is to say, Norm Kurth, in his book, Project Retrospectives, says, wow, so many positive things. This must have been a success. But I think my definition of success would be that people on the project would say, I would do this over again in exactly the same way. Now you let that sit for a minute. And you can tell that everyone in the room is saying, no, I don't think so.
Wasn't that
and I
great?
thought, yeah. So even on the most successful project, there are always a few things that we would do differently if we had to do it over again. So the question is not all the bad things. We're not asking for that.
Yeah.
What we're asking is, what would you do differently? And that also sets the tone for the retrospective, which is, we're not here to whine and complain. We're here to learn.
Right.
And our approach is...
It's forward-looking, although it's called retrospective.
Yes. It's our purpose is to say, looking forward, based on our experience, what would we do differently? So this is not the end of the retrospective. Sometimes people think, well, that's it. We can... No, it's just getting people thinking and framing, which is another brain thing, framing the kinds of things we want to hear. So it's all of the good things and what would you do differently? So again, you capture those microwave popcorn tests, and now you have those on the wall, and you can always point back to those. But it's a very good way to start. And let me say, by the way, that these exercises that are in Norm's book come from dysfunctional family therapy.
I mean, honestly?
Yes, honestly. So you wonder, how is it that the connection was made between dysfunctional families and software teams?
Cool. Okay. So the next one I wrote down is timeline. And that's probably a way of going back these 6 months and remembering stuff explicitly, right?
Yes. And I love timelines. I keep thinking maybe I'll find a better way to go back. But that is the best way. And a timeline is simply a large space. It can be on the wall, but often I'm in an environment where you can't use the wall. We can't put a pin or a piece of tape or anything else on the wall. So I've done timelines on tables, on the floor. Just has to be a large space. And so you divide the large space up into a series of events so that everyone understands what the points are on the timeline. So they might simply be January, February, March. They might be first quarter, second quarter, third quarter. They might be milestones. I leave that up to the team. How do you want to divide the timeline up? And then we use a collection of colored cards. The cards are all anonymous. And people write on them what happened as far as they're concerned, what the significant events were, and then the colors reflect how they felt about that particular event. So one of the events might have been, and since we mentioned it already, the database was late. So if the person was angry about that, they would write it on a red card. If they were angry or frustrated or upset, put it on a red card. Maybe they were working on something and they were late, and they knew that as long as the database was delayed, their stuff was okay. So they were happy about that. So they might write it on a blue card to say, oh, sky is blue. I'm happy the database is late. Yay! So you can see the same event on different colors. The other two that I use are yellow for surprise. That means, well, we didn't expect this, but we're not upset about it. And green for challenge. People use a variety of colors. Some people don't use colors. But what you get with colors is you can stand back from the timeline, and now you can see, how were people at the beginning? Is it all blue? And then you have them talk about just, what does that look like to you? What do you see? And they can see for themselves, oh, this is where the red came in. Or it started as yellow, a few yellow surprises that became red. And then we had that bad third quarter. And then...
It's a little bit like building team memory.
Yes. because you have people continuously write cards, post it on the timeline.
And that influences my further thinking about things. So
they read what's on the timeline, and then that helps them remember. And when the popcorn test, again, you don't see too many cards, then we do something like the artifacts contest, sort of in the middle.
You mentioned that before already. It's about bringing stuff in?
Yes, it's about bringing in any object. So you ask people beforehand to think back and to bring in what for them was a significant object. And it could be, here's a copy of the original schedule. Remember that?
Right.
Remember the party we had at the end of the first quarter when things were going well, and we got T-shirts and we got little rubber ducks because of something to do with a project. You don't always get the inside jokes, and somebody has some of those little rubber ducks, and people look at that and they go, "Oh, I remember," and it's exactly what happens at Christmas. When you unpack the ornaments and you see something that your daughter made when she was 3 years old, and it's made of glittery stuff and macaroni, and all of a sudden you remember her when she was 3 years old. So somebody brings in the little rubber duck and you say, I remember that party. And now I remember some other things that should go on the timeline.
So you use the artifact contest as, I see.
Yeah.
So as
you
a further
play that in the middle.
I see, cool.
You play that in the middle.
Very good,
And so now a few more cards go up, and people are now remembering more things.
And people tell a story about the thing they bring, I guess.
Exactly so. And sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's sad. But now the team itself they're sort of remembering together. Whereas when they started the timeline, they were each working individually. So it starts to bring them together. And the next exercise, we're still in the middle of the timeline, is called Offer Appreciations. And for that, I just ask them to take a seat. Usually we sit in a little circle. And the rules are that you can say to someone, Marcus, I remember when you stayed over that weekend. I remember it now. You stayed over that weekend before the first customer demo. And if you hadn't been here all weekend working on those, remember those 2 big errors? The thing kept blowing up. We wouldn't have been able to do that demo. But I also remember that you missed your son's birthday party. I'm not sure. Did we ever say thank you for that? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that you did that for the team. And now somebody will remember something else. And you let that go as long as it goes. Way beyond the microwave test. Way beyond. Because sometimes people are reluctant. And they will hang back. But they need to say that. They need to get that out. And I've seen grizzled veterans, little tears. I've seen people who were not too happy about the whole thing, the retrospective, the team. I've seen them sort of come in and join the team and offer appreciations. So it's such a powerful exercise. And I close that by saying, there's no reason why you have to wait for a retrospective to do that. You should do that all the time. Just appreciate each other.
So this thing is obviously quite a bit emotional.
It can be very emotional.
Which is the perfect segue into the next thing we wrote down, which is called emotion seismograph?
Emotion seismograph. And of course, after each one of these, after the artifacts contest and after offer appreciations, we put more cards on the wall. The timeline is still growing.
That's kind of that's something you do in parallel to some of those things.
Because we haven't finished it yet. And the seismograph is underneath the timeline. You save a little bit of space at the bottom, maybe 2 feet or so, and you ask people to, if they could draw a little bit like an EKG or an electrocardiogram that would say, at this point in the timeline, how are you feeling? So the top of the seismographs is, I'm so happy to be here. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And the very bottom is, oh, how fast can I find another job and get out of here?
Everybody does it, and then you get a kind of aggregate curve or something.
Yeah, they just draw a little curve that runs along the bottom, and you can see where the highs and lows were for individuals, whether they're the same or different. And it kind of gives you a picture of what you have with the timeline and the seismograph is you have a story of the project itself. So once you've done all of that, then the timeline is ready for the next phase. You've done what you can do. I usually have, after everything is up, I ask people to walk the wall, if they haven't, to make sure they've read every single card and to go back in their minds to remember what happened. That's the end of the timeline.
Okay. 4 more of those things. The next one would be mine for gold.
So now you've got the timeline, and now what you want to do is build on those comments. And over time, I've kind of changed the way I do that. But what I ask people to do is take those cards and let's put them in categories. So we have sort of a mind map of what were we talking about? What were we talking about? Are there a lot of database problems? Are there some testing problems? Are there some customer interaction problems? I don't classify that. I ask them to do it. And so we cluster them, and then we label each one of those categories. So what we're trying to do is pull out from the timeline what are the actions going forward, and to identify issues that need to be addressed. And while that's going on, people might add more cards.
Why is this called mine for gold?
What you're trying to do is pull out, you know what miners do, they go underground and they dig, and they have to go through a lot of dirt to actually pull up the nuggets. And so the process begins that way, but we're far from finished. We have to examine those categories now. So I ask for volunteers, and they self-select to work on the category and to decide, can we pull out some action items? Can we pull out some lessons learned? What can we do to mine this category? And so we split up so we can do that in parallel. Depends on the size of the team, how many categories there are, how you do that. And also, if this is a project retrospective, how much time do we have?
Right.
So we spend a certain amount of time on that, and then each team reports back, here are the nuggets.
Right.
Here's the gold they found in this process.
Gold being the action items for the next stage.
The potential.
potential
action items from the process.
Okay.
Yes.
Change the paper.
Change the paper is not an exercise I do, but what it means is that we're going to look at what was done, and we're going to, if you continue the way I was working, we need to look at what happened to decide what we're going to do differently. So we would sort of begin to capture all of those suggestions, and now we need to narrow them down.
Right.
So there are lots of ways of doing that. And again, it depends on, is this a team that's going to stay together? Will they really be able to take actions? Is there going to be a follow-on release, for instance, so that we really can assign people action items? Otherwise, if we just make a list and nobody does anything, it's kind of a waste of time. So what happens next depends upon the character of the organization, pretty much. Change the paper means let's do something differently going forward.
And write a letter. That's
write a letter. Now, where did you get that?
I'm sure it's in Norm's book, so we'll cut that out.
Okay, because I'm not sure it is. I think that's an exercise that I did, that I created on the spot.
Maybe
And I presented that. One of the things we do at the Retrospectives gathering is we talk about new ideas for exercises. And one year, I had done a retrospective for a team that was severely depressed. We did the retrospective at the end of a period when they knew they were all going to be taken off of the project and weren't even sure whether they were still going to have a job with the company. It was going to be outsourced. You know, this is an old story now. It was going to be outsourced, and so there was no way to hand an action item forward. So we'd gone through all of this, and suddenly, because I didn't really understand that, and here I am in the middle of the retrospective realizing that these people don't care.
Mm-hmm.
They're leaving.
Mm-hmm.
They're either going to have another job or they're going to be assigned to a different project.
Yep.
And the whole thing is going to India or China or someplace.
So you write the letter to the guy who's continuing the project?
So that, I mean, it was one of those moments where the muse descends. And I thought, I got to find a way out of this because we can't have action items. What are we going to do? So I gave them each some paper. And I said, I know you'll never meet the people on the team, but just imagine someone on the other team and sit down and tell them from your point of view, whatever your role was on the team, pretend you're talking to the person who will have that role on the other team and write them a letter that tells them your thoughts about what went on, your thoughts about what should happen. And so I tried to inspire them by saying, you know, I'm closer to the end of my life than the beginning. And I know that at some point I'm going to die. But that doesn't mean that I don't care about what happens in the world.
Right.
That doesn't mean that I might not have some last words of wisdom based on my experience that I would be happy to share just because I care about what goes on with other human beings, because that concern lasts, I think, until you have your last breath. So I said, you could think of yourself in that way, that you're dying with respect to this project. That doesn't mean you don't care about that other person. It's not their fault you're getting laid off. It's not their fault that things didn't go well. So think of this as one person talking to another. Let me tell you what I can. And I thought, well, we'll see how this goes. And it was so surprising because they just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And they were just pouring out their hearts. And then in the meantime, the project manager came back and he said, what are you doing? And I said, they're writing letters to the people on the other team. And he thought, wow, that's brilliant, brilliant. So he promised to the team, he said, I will make sure that these letters are all delivered to the people on the new team.
Cool.
I promise you that.
This is, I think, an important point. I think that you really need to follow up on the things you do there. I mean, you know, really make sure the action items are executed, and, you know, just make the people feel that what they did in the retrospective actually is useful.
Yes, absolutely. Otherwise, they won't believe.
Right, and that would have been the last
waste
retrospective.
Of time. Yes. Although I have seen retrospectives where just having it was good enough.
Right, because
just
of the
reflection. Fact
reflection.
they got to go through it, and the story I tell is about a team that was in fact my first retrospective, where the team put up an enormous timeline, and when you see that what they get out of walking up and down the timeline and standing in little groups, talking about the cards, pointing to cards, touching cards, and you think that was worth it, even if nothing comes out of it. But of course, it's always good to say, because we learned this, we're going to make sure that something happens.
Are there any other practices / games that you like and you like to mention that I didn't ask you about?
The one I like to do at the end is called Hopes and Wishes. I think this is in Norm's book, but I'm not sure. It may just be something that I adapted. But I ask the team, especially if they're going forward with another release and they're going to stay together, is to write on a card a sentence or two that begins, I hope, or I wish, and it's their hope or wish for the next release. And then we collect those and we put them in a little sealed envelope, a sort of like a time capsule. And then at the next retrospective, we open that and we read from the hopes and wishes. And sometimes, and this is optional, when they're all through, and I said, before I collect those, would anyone like to read a hope or a wish? And sometimes they do. And so that sort of, that's the last thing we do. That's absolutely the very end of the exercises as they're ready to walk out the door.
Yep.
It sort of gives them something as, on my way out the door, I hope, and then their hope or wish.
Yep.
So it's a good way to close.
So we already covered this idea that a retrospective is not a blaming exercise.
Yes.
There is another prejudice or misconception or problem that I could imagine, and that is that the participants think those practices and games are childish.
Yes.
What do you say to those people?
The games are always optional. And I have led retrospectives where some people would not participate. In fact, the example that comes to mind was a team that I led where obviously there were some problems. This was not a failed project, but a project that did not deliver successfully. And it was held off-site, and we had catered lunch. So the company obviously spent a fair amount of money on this. And when they came in, they were all late. So that's kind of a signal right there. They came in late. They obviously didn't care about what was going on. And one individual in particular did not sit with the rest of the team.
Wow.
So he sat in the corner.
Strong signal.
He sat in the corner. He would not participate. And everything that we did was kind of a joke. People, I think it was a joke to everybody.
Okay.
And so we were building the timeline. And now they were writing silly comments and putting them on the wall. So obviously they'd had some problems. So we did the artifacts contest and they hadn't brought anything.
Sure.
They didn't care. So I thought, well, we offer appreciations. So I said, well, here's how this game works. Well, they thought it was really hilarious. Now this is going to be so funny. So then somebody started. Said, well, all right, I want to thank, and it was kind of a joke thing, I want to thank so-and-so for, doing something. And everybody laughed. Okay. And then the next one was a little more serious. Said, well, I'm thinking back to, and all of a sudden, it happened while he was speaking. That it was though they'd been sleepwalking and they woke up. We remember what this was all about. And we remember that at one time we cared. And in fact, for that individual, he could not finish his appreciation. And it's hard for me to watch that because I sit off to the side and I get really involved with these guys, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I can't cry in front of this team. I have to maintain my level of professional, not be involved. But he couldn't finish, and it was clear that he was on the verge of tears, and so he just stopped, and I said, it's all right. You can finish your appreciation later, and that just changed the tone for the whole thing. And then someone else spoke, and then the guy in the corner. He came in and he said, I just want to say thank you for putting up with me. And he sat down. So what I learned from that was sometimes we get into a role or a place, like I'm the skeptic. I'm the old guy. I'm the one who doesn't care. I'm the one who always makes fun of everything. I'm the, whatever it is. And then we realize that we're not happy there, but we can't get out.
Yep. Right. I know that. Yeah.
So one thing that can happen, and since I've seen that now several times since that, is that in a retrospective, you're almost offering people a chance to really change who they are, what their role is on the team, and that the whole team can sort of shuffle itself. And when they walk out, it's not the same team that walked in. And I'm not enough of a therapist to understand what it is. All I know is that I've seen it, and that it was astounding to me that these exercises, the way they're structured and obviously if they are based on dysfunctional family therapy, that they're there for a reason, and that they call to people to say, it's okay, you can say the truth, and you can be somebody that you want to be, and that's so much more powerful than I thought a retrospective was ever all about. So it was a revelation to me.
So how do I convince management? I mean, I really need to know this. This is a very selfish question. I said I had this customer. So, I mean, how do I, if management thinks, okay, yeah, well, that's just one of those other agile hype things. I mean, except for having people listen to this episode or call you and let you tell them, what do I do to convince especially skeptical managers who don't want to pay or spend the time?
So my experience is that management does see the benefits ahead of the technical staff.
Okay.
That they know that there's a benefit to trying to learn from your experience. I mean, most managers have heard knowledge management or a learning organization, and so they run into issues like that at their level all the time, and they don't have any idea how to make that happen. And it's the technical people who usually see, well, why do we have to spend time getting together for another meeting where we talk about stuff? I mean, they're the ones who are the most difficult to convince. The managers, and especially high-level managers, the people who pay for things or who authorize payment, they are usually the easiest to sell if you just tell them a little bit about what goes on, and the purpose of it is learning, and that you want to improve, you want to have constant improvement. They know what the importance of those things, and here's the real benefit for especially higher level managers is that you can say, you know, when we finish this, we'll have a lot of information. We'll have timelines, we'll have flip charts full of stuff, and you can come into the room
once it's done.
When it's done, and you can read all of those comments on the cards, and you can see what got put on the flip charts. Now, that's appealing because it's a way for them to really hear the voice of the people who are on the bottom. Because when they ask for information, it's often filtered through 3 or 4 layers. And by the time they get the story of what happened on Project X, it's so far removed from the real experience, they never hear the truth. So what you can offer them is a chance to hear the voices of the people on the team telling it as they saw it.
And if they're not interested in that, I guess there is a deeper problem.
Yeah, there is probably, but you know, my experience is, of course, I'm talking about the organizations that call me in.
Sure. Yes. So they call you in.
They have some some interest in it, but nonetheless, they're not necessarily sure how it's all going to work out. But at the end of the day, these high-level individuals will come into the room, and here you've got walls covered with stuff or cards all over the table. They will read everything. You can say, well, now here are the piles of cards that we took. They will pick up every single card. Cool. I mean every card. And if we have them on the floor, they'll get down on their knees and read every flip chart. You can say, oh, well, these are the things, and they go right up to the wall. They look at every bullet, and sometimes they'll go back. These are busy people who don't have a lot of time. They'll go back, and they'll take notes. They're really interested in what comes out of a retrospective. I didn't, and that was something, again, I didn't realize until I had seen it for myself.
Is there a relationship to continuous improvement, like CMM stuff? Is it in, I mean, you are, in a way, continuously improving your team and your process and the way you work.
I don't think you can be at a higher CMM level than 1 unless you are doing some form of retrospective. And the higher you go, the more a part of your process it has to be.
Yep.
It might not be called a retrospective, and there might not be the deep connection, what Norm has done for the software development community, but there is certainly some pretty well-defined process that says we've got to go back and learn from our experience.
So in order for people to help them to learn more about retrospectives, I think we have to solve the norm question. Who is this guy? Why did you mention it all the time? What's this book all about?
Norm Kurth. You know what's interesting about this conference is that the one we are, where we are is QCon, is that I'm continually struck by the number of presenters and keynote speakers who are big names or important people in the agile software development community who were also major contributors to the patterns community. So Kent Beck, Martin Fowler, Eric Gamma, and Norm Kurth was also a member of the patterns community.
He
we
was actually
have the best.
my first shepherd.
Was he?
Yeah.
So I think the patterns community contributed an enormous amount to the entire software development community, not only as patterns, but agile and in other areas as well. So Norm Kurth, I met in the patterns community, and he was not a shepherd for me ever, but when I did my first retrospective, it was because we were doing design patterns and I was the patterns person. And we had a failure, an enormous failure. And so my manager came to see me and he said, I don't know what the connection is, but the whole company realizes that this was something that had major impact. And so we think there might be patterns here. In the sense that they're patterns of things we don't want to do. So that was before anti-patterns. He said, can't you find out whether there are patterns here? That's how I got involved in retrospectives. And I said, I'll try. I don't know how to begin. And I knew Norm was working on this. There was no book at the time, but Norm led me through it. He was the one who outlined what we should do with this project and how we could find out. And we did. We did find patterns. That's how I met Norm. I got to know him very well at that time. And he was working on the book, Project Retrospectives.
Which is kind of the standard.
It is the only book on Project Retrospectives. Esther Derby and Diana Larson have written a book on agile retrospectives. And it builds on Norm's book. So it sort of tailors the retrospective process to the shorter, iterative, or we call it heartbeat retrospectives. So it in no way displaces it. It is equally valuable. You need them both. Of course, there are a lot of papers. If you go to my website, and we will probably have a link to that.
We will
or
put
something.
your website and the book and stuff into the show notes.
So if you go to my website, I've written several articles on retrospectives, and that's a good place to start because it doesn't cost anything.
And it's probably shorter than a book.
And it's shorter, and it will give you kind of an overview. And Esther and I wrote an article for Cutter on the combination that I see between retrospectives and patterns. And one of the valuable things, if you do it in your own organization, I can't do it anymore because I only go in as an isolated outsider. I go in, I do the retrospective, I leave. But if you do them across projects in an organization, after a while you can begin to see patterns. And they're the patterns for your organization, so you should begin to document those. And that's kind of what I moved into in the company where I was doing design patterns. All of a sudden I'm writing patterns for project teams, which is something very new for me. So that's the book. It's called Project Retrospectives. It was published by Dorset House in, I think, 2001. It has been translated into a plethora of languages. Norm had a very serious automobile accident, and he doesn't do consulting anymore. He's still a valuable contributor to the retrospectives community, And so another resource is the Yahoo list, which is called Retrospectives, I think. We should probably look that up.
Put that in.
And so if anyone appears on that discussion with a question.
It's an open group, I guess.
It's open.
Yeah, okay.
Anyone can sign up for it. So anyone who appears on there is always surprised that at some point, it has to be when he's feeling okay, that Norm will answer. So he will tell you what he thinks about, how cool is that? Yeah. And I'm there, Esther's there, Diana's there, Rachel Davies is a major contributor. She's somebody else who's here. She's the one who's hosting the gathering this year, even while she's chairing Agile 2008. Oh, I don't know how. She is my hero, absolutely. So it's a community that's small enough. I mean, the patterns community was like that. I don't know whether you remember. In the beginning, I could get on the patterns discussion listserv, and I could get answers from the Gang of Four.
Yeah, it was before my time.
John Vlasides. That's when I first met John.
Yeah.
So, and I miss him terribly. That can happen when it's small.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So the patterns community is so much bigger now. So we've kind of lost that.
Yeah.
But the retrospectives community is not only small, but we try to encourage everyone. So
you have to. I mean, that's what you preach in retrospectives. You know.
Yes. So people sign on and say, I'm new to this. I'm just trying to get this going in my company. Here's a problem I have, and boom, boom, boom. You'll get answers from the people who write the books. So I encourage people to go sign up for that. And we'll have to look up the exact name.
Yeah, we'll do that.
I can't remember what it is. But I think it's retrospectives@yahoo.com.
Okay, we'll find it.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of the planned stuff.
Okay.
So do you want to maybe let us know why you're interested in brain and primates to wrap this thing up? and I guess there is some relationship to teams, software, process. I think. That's what you make money with.
Actually, okay, so somebody asked me a question just recently. What's the book that most changed or influenced your life? So I've been thinking about that, and I realized that it was the last book I wrote, which was Fearless Change, Patterns for Introducing New Ideas.
Which is maybe something we can do an episode on sometime in the future, if you're interested.
I am. I'm always interested in talking about change.
Okay.
I started writing that book in 1995. And at the time, if you had said, well, Linda, who are you? I would have described myself as a designer. And I was interested in design patterns. And the reason I started thinking about the patterns that are in Fearless Change was because I wanted the people in my organization, the other developers, to use design patterns. So I thought, there must be patterns for doing this.
Right.
Patterns for helping people use patterns. And that's how those patterns started. And as I began to write them, I thought, well, how do people solve problems? I mean, that's the benefit of a pattern, is that it helps you solve. Is that really the best way? I became interested in how people solve problems, in how you help other people solve problems, how I convince other people to use my ideas to solve their problems, things I had never thought of before, things I wasn't really interested in before. I have lots of technical degrees. I started out as a chemist, and I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry with a minor in biochemistry. I was a chemist for a while. Then I became a mathematician. I taught mathematics for a while. And then I became a computer scientist. I have a PhD in computer science. In all of that, I had one psychology course because it was required. And I hated it. I thought it was boring. And I thought it was not interesting. I didn't care about the experiments. So it was only later in thinking about, I want to help people use patterns, that I became interested in it. And now psychology has changed. As my husband says, the reason you like this stuff now is it is technical. because we can actually look at your brain.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
We can do functional MRIs.
Mm-hmm.
We can do scans.
So it's a precise science as opposed to this fluffy blah 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 stuff.
That's right. And instead of talking about theories for behavior, we actually know what parts of the brain are involved in fear, for instance, in learning.
Yeah.
And in fact, something I read just recently that I talked about yesterday. So it's so exciting and it's so new, is that they can hear rat brains talking to each other as the rats sleep. So they can actually monitor the neurons as they're saying, all right, well, here's how we ran this maze today. Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
well,
how
let's
do they
store
communicate?
that. Well, they do it while the rat is sleeping.
But
the hippocampus has a connection to the neocortex, which is where learning takes place.
So the rat is talking to itself.
Yes.
I see.
Rat
I
is talking to
thought
itself.
two rats are talking to
No.
Okay.
No, the rat is talking to itself and is storing away information that it's gathered as it learned the maze.
Yep.
And if that doesn't happen, no learning takes place.
Yep.
So we know just even recently a little bit more about the mechanism, that it happens while you're sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, we know which phase, because we can see where the rat is. It's in the deep REM phase of sleep.
Yep.
So people who are walking around sleep deprived, they don't learn as well.
Right.
It's not some sort of fuzzy thing that we watch people and we say, you can actually wire up their brains and watch those neurons fire. It's incredibly fast. I mean, I'm getting so excited thinking about, if I could start over again, I would go to medical school and I would somehow be involved in studying the brain. It's just so intriguing to me.
Any good book tips for people who are interested in the brain? I know people have talked about an interesting book on I think on the Twit podcast or something. I don't remember what the book was, but they talked about a relatively new book by some kind of internet entrepreneur who wrote something. I don't know.
There are so many because this area is expanding exponentially.
Right.
It's a very fast-growing science, and every day I subscribe to Scientific American Mind, which gives me a real quick overview, and then it will point to articles, and those articles are on the web. So I can go out and read the articles, and I get a brain newsletter. I mean, there's just so much information, and it is all, and you know what? It ties in directly. Everything I learn fits with agile software development. Because one thing I'm learning is that agile software development does have some pretty deep connections, just as patterns do. That they're good things because they fit with the way we think, with the way we're hardwired, with the way we solve problems, with the way we work together. It enhances all of that. And what the evolutionary biologists tell us is that if you kind of move or operate in sync with the way your brain is structured, you're going to be only more effective, you're going to be happier. You can actually measure that. Look at the chemicals, you know, dopamine. And so it's fascinating.
Okay, we have to stop. I'm actually literally running out of recording time here.
Okay.
So
good.
Thank you very much, Linda. I think this was fascinating,
my pleasure.
Very, very useful. And
Great.
We'll get you back for the skill exchange stuff sometime later.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons. To contact the team, please send email to team@seradio.net, or if it's specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can read and react to your comments. This episode of Software Engineering Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the PodSafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.